Over the next 2 days, the CEO of Boeing will be questioned by members of Congress about what's happened with the 737 MAX. He says he's confident that once the plane is fixed, it will be one of the safest ever. Meanwhile, Air Canada, we talked about that, feeling some financial pain because of the grounding of those planes. WestJet also has several MAX jets in its fleet. Let's get some perspective on how that airline is watching this all unfold. Ed Sims is the CEO of WestJet. That company just reported revenue and profit that topped estimates. He joins us this morning from Calgary, and of course the company also working towards the pending privatization with Onyx. Ed, thanks very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, John.
You're up early. I guess if you're an airline CEO, or you just train, like we're all trained to get to the airport early for those flights, is it just part of your DNA that you're always arriving for your meetings like 3 hours ahead of time?
Well, look, if you're going to be asked to run Canada's most on-time airline, the least we can do is get to our interviews on time.
Touche. Listen, we have to start with what's happening in Washington this week with Boeing. We referenced that your rival Air Canada having to address some questions from analysts about what's going on right now. How do you view everything happening with the 737 MAX right now?
Yeah, this is a fascinating time. It's always like this. It's always this degree of volatility, to be honest, in the aviation industry. We always know life can be a roller coaster and you get puts and takes in every decision you make. This has been like the longest disruption, rolling disruption I can ever remember in my career in aviation. We've had these aircraft now on the ground, 13 MAX aircraft in WestJet colors for the last 9 months. We have had to cope, and we have coped astonishingly well. 14,000 WestJetters have worked our existing fleet harder. We've built more business-orientated schedules. We've launched our 787 transatlantically with a full business class service to London, Paris, and Dublin. We continue to build our ultra-low-cost carrier Swoop. So we've gone on doing what we can do to improve our guest experience, to build shareholder returns, and to make sure that WestJetters feel as they've always felt that they share in those rewards.
You've got your customers to deal with, but you are a customer of Boeing. How would you grade the customer service at Boeing during this time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Amber. I would grade it no higher than a B. I expect A+ service from every supplier to WestJet, just as we expect our customers to evaluate us in the same way. I think Boeing have missed a beat, frankly, in the way that they've responded to this crisis. They've responded well of late, and we're having some robust commercial discussions about not just the impact that this frustrating grounding has had to date, but really what happens in the next 6 months. From the point at which Canadian airspace is again cleared, we're going to see a very significant amount of capacity coming back into the marketplace. And it could yet be that some of the toughest financial challenges will still be ahead of us as we see a significant amount of capacity come back into the market.
And how do you adjust for that?
We adjust for that by making sure that we continue to concentrate our schedules around the requirements of both our business and premium travelers and our leisure travelers. We continue to build our hubs, particularly here in Calgary, in Toronto, and in Vancouver. We continue to make sure that we can use our domestic services and our transborder services to continue to feed the growing Dreamliners. We'll be taking delivery of another 3 Boeing 787 Dreamliners January, February, March next year. Tomorrow we'll be announcing one of our new transatlantic routes. So we're continuing to do what we do best, which is build really logical, sensible schedules and make sure that the quality of the product is reflected in our pricing.
So a B grade for Boeing, where specifically did they fall short?
I think the management of expectations, I think they were very optimistic in the early instances. In the final analysis, no matter what evaluation we rule over this, 346 people lost their lives. And that's the core issue at the heart of everything that's happened in October last year and again in March this year. And we looked for early acknowledgement from Boeing of the role that changes to the configuration of the MAX had made. That has come, but it came later than I would have expected. And I think we also needed closer collaboration and a higher degree of transparency with the regulators around the world, and in particular with the 4 regulators who will govern the reopening of airspace and the ungrounding of these aircraft. It has happened belatedly. We'd like it to have happened earlier, but there is no question in my mind that I remain committed to our forward order book for these MAX aircraft. And as their CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, has said, with the level of scrutiny on these aircraft, when they come back into the skies, they will be the safest Boeing aircraft that have ever flown.
So before we move beyond Boeing, since you mentioned the CEO, we mentioned he's testifying in front of lawmakers today, even though you guys have direct ties to the company and can get your own answers to certain issues. What would you like to hear him answer today? I mean, what do you think is the most important thing for him to address?
Well, I think the most important things, John, that Dennis Muilenburg can now address are absolute transparency around the software certification path, that we can sign off in absolute confidence that MCAS will effectively create the checks and balances of our flight operation that we fully expect. And then I'll be expecting Mr. Muilenburg to make sure that he will acknowledge the role of the regulators, that nothing will happen until the regulators declare it safe. And I want him to reaffirm that for airlines like WestJet that have a 100% Boeing jet fleet, that will be recognized in the way that they will essentially construct appropriate remuneration and compensation for those customers like ourselves who have made such strong forward commitments to the forward order book for the MAX aircraft.
Let's talk about the big Onyx deal. Are we still roughly on schedule for the deal closing by year end or the beginning of 2020?
That's everything that we have in mind currently, Amber. We have one final approval, which is with the Canadian Transport Agency. The Onyx deal relies on a number of individual entities between ourselves and Onyx that we are constructing in the best interests of transparency for the deal. The Canadian Transport Agency rightly want to have 100% confidence in the Canadian nature of every single one of those entities. They're being very, very rigorous in the questions they're asking us, as we expected, but we remain on track, and we firmly believe that this deal, in the best interests of all Canadian travelers, will close before the end of this financial year.
How do you ensure the Canadianness? As you know, your rival Air Canada wrote to the Canadian Transport Agency and said there are a lot of foreign investors in Onyx that could ultimately overwhelm the majority of votes at Onyx, and thus Onyx controlling Air Canada, WestJet, your company. That would ultimately violate the provisions of limited foreign ownership in your airline. Do you have a response to that letter that Air Canada wrote?
Well, frankly, anybody is entitled to their opinion on the strength of our deal. The dialogue will remain between the Canadian Transport Agency, Onyx, and WestJet, and that's the way it should remain. So I have no comment on their observations, just as I would expect them, that my views on their forthcoming deal will be less material. So yes, of course, I was interested in what they had to say, but in the final analysis, what matters is the relationship between ourselves, Onyx, and the CTA.
Speaking about Canada, obviously we just had a federal election, and there's been a big conversation around the deep divide, east versus west. As a Calgary-based business, what has been your take on all that? Is there something that you think lawmakers could be doing right now actually to alleviate some of that stress that we are seeing?
Look, we're a whole of Canadian airline, John. Our footprint stretches from Vancouver Island over to Newfoundland. So, we are looking at a whole of Canada and a unifying theme behind Canadian politics at the moment. We are proudly headquartered in Calgary and in Alberta, and we continue to see real strength in both the Calgary and the Albertan economy because we continue to grow both our guest volumes through this province, but also the quality of our revenue. So we're not seeing a financial downturn. What we are seeing is the benefit of recent corporate tax breaks within Alberta that have been very beneficial to the business. And we continue to have sufficient strength in the local economy to look to continue to put more 787s here out of our home hub in Calgary. So our message really to both the Premier of Alberta, but also to the federal politicians is, please ensure that business interests remain at the top of the agenda, because we are about creating employment. And the more employment we create, the more we can bolster the local economy, and the more we can continue to strengthen the quality of jobs, both in the transportation and in the tourism industry.
It's so interesting you say that you're seeing growth in places like Calgary and Edmonton, because so much of the conversation post-election has been about the sense of alienation in two provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, evidenced by the fact that the Liberals were effectively shut out there. The growth of this Wexit movement, even though it remains on the fringe, perhaps the fact that it exists, suggests that there is some disenfranchisement. How do you reconcile that with what you're seeing on the ground?
Well, for a start, we're not seeing any reluctance on the part of Calgarians or Albertans to travel. You know, look, it's -11 here today, and the colder it gets, the more people are inclined to head off to warmer climes. But on a more serious note, you know, the 787 is an equivalent investment to pipelines in the sky. While pipelines are not getting improved locally here in Alberta, we continue to be able to move the movers and shakers, the decision makers, to points in Europe, to points elsewhere around the world, particularly with our links to places like Houston down south, that are creating those business flows that enable Alberta's natural resources to be traded once more. If I look at a new route that we introduced earlier this year, like Calgary-Atlanta, over 90% of the guests traveling on that service are flowing onto our partner Delta's network. So it's about building connections, it's about building hubs, and it's about making sure that we can swim counterintuitively to prevailing economic gloom here in Alberta at the moment.
All right, so Calgary to Atlanta is one route, but I'm sure you've heard a lot of people talking about this New York to Australia 20-hour flight from Qantas. It's a pretty long haul in an era where a lot of people are now talking about environmental concerns, things like flight shaming, for example. What do you make of the idea of a 20-hour flight?
Yeah, it was going to come. We've got the capability. You know, in a previous life, when I was in a very geographically isolated country in New Zealand, we would regularly operate 16.5, 17-hour flights. Any airline worth its salt wants to test the capability of its aircraft and make sure that we can operate as efficiently as possible. There's a lot to be said for the environmental benefit of one 20-hour flight than a series of regular hops that are actually burning more fuel by feeding passengers to a hub and then flying shorter sectors in between. The fluke scam flight shame movement is very real, and it behoves every airline like WestJet to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce fuel consumption, to ensure that we operate on basis of reduced power units at the airports, single engine taxiing, improved flight trajectories and flight plans in conjunction with NAV Canada. We are making a series of small steps. They may not be 20-hour flights yet for WestJet, but we're making a series of small steps that are very dedicated to reducing our own carbon footprint.
Can you give me a reason for Canadian passengers to be optimistic? I mean, if you stand back and look at what's going on in the industry, your airline about to be taken out by a private equity company. Historically, private equity has an eye to the bottom line, and that could come at a sacrifice to customer service. A rival in Air Canada taking out another competitor, so you've got consolidation and then control of your company in private equity. Does that really spell a scenario that's going to lead to great customer service and affordability for Canadian passengers over the next 10 years?
Well, let me give two reasons for confidence, Amber. One, we talked earlier about the MAX. Let's talk about safety and let's talk about competition. So 2017 was the safest year in history in aviation history, safest year on record. 2018 was the third safest. The earliest was also in this decade. So flying has never been safer, notwithstanding the terrible tragedies at Lion and Ethiopian. Underlying that all, flying remains over 8 times safer and a better safety record than traveling in our own personal car. And if I look at competition, in 1996, the average cost of a one-way domestic flight was around $290 adjusted for fuel. The average cost of that same domestic flight within Canada today is $160. Now, over that time, 45 million more Canadians have traveled over that period. 1996 happened to be the year that WestJet started. So I think there are huge grounds for optimism, both about competition, about safety, and the quality of in-flight product that most guests rate higher than it's ever been.
All right, Ed. Well, the benefits of getting up early, getting to the airport early, you're done with us now. You can get back and get busy with your business day. Ed, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it as always.
We're looking forward to building quarter four. Thanks so much, John. Thank you, Amber.
Ed Sims, CEO of WestJet, joining us.